My husband signed the final document, leaned back in his leather chair, and smirked directly at me. "That's it," he said, not even trying to hide the malice in his voice. "Everything your father left behind is officially mine." He'd already changed the locks on our home, bragged to his entire family that I was walking away penniless, and even his attorney gave him a smug handshake. I sat in silence, my hands resting in my lap, letting him savor his moment of victory. But then, my father's lifelong estate attorney cleared his throat. "Not quite, Mr. Vance," he said quietly. He reached inside his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, wax-sealed yellow envelope marked with bold red ink. "Open only if her husband claims everything." My husband chuckled, thinking it was a joke, until the lawyer broke the seal and read the very first sentence. "My name is Eleanor Vance, and at 34 years old, I thought I knew what a partnership looked like. I am a high school history teacher, someone who spends her days looking at the long game of human nature, analyzing patterns, and trusting that actions always have consequences. For 8 years, I was married to Julian. Charismatic, sharp, and upwardly mobile, Julian worked as a senior financial advisor in downtown Chicago. He was the kind of man who could light up a room with a smile, make anyone feel like the most important person in the world, and effortlessly take charge of every room he walked into, including mine. Then there was my father, Arthur Vance. Dad was a self-made real estate investor who built his portfolio from scratch through decades of quiet discipline and painstaking diligence. He was soft-spoken, deeply perceptive, and lived below his means. And from the moment Julian entered my life, Dad saw straight through him. Dad never made a scene or raised his voice, but I noticed the way his eyes narrowed whenever Julian casually brought up family finances over Sunday dinners, asking eager, pointed questions about property titles, trust funds, and holding companies. Over 5 years, Julian systematically worked to erode my financial autonomy. It started small, suggesting we combine our accounts for convenience, taking over tax filings, and quietly insisting I sign joint financial disclosures. He positioned himself as the expert, subtly convincing me that I didn't need to stress over the numbers, because he had everything handled. I loved him, so I trusted him. When my father passed away unexpectedly from a sudden heart failure, the grief hit me like a physical blow. But while I was drowning in loss, Julian transformed overnight. The grieving son-in-law vanished, replaced by an intensely focused strategist. Within 48 hours of the funeral, he was already demanding to manage the entire inheritance process, insisting that my emotional state made me unfit to handle the legalities alone. He thought he was closing in on his ultimate prize. 2 weeks after the funeral, we sat in the mahogany-paneled conference room of Dad's lifelong estate attorney, Mr. Harrison. The air was heavy with the scent of old paper and polished wood. Julian sat beside me, dressed in a sharp tailor-made suit, posture rigid with anticipation. He had brought along his personal corporate lawyer, a man whose presence felt less like legal counsel and more like an enforcement officer. Julian fully expected a quick, triumphant handover of Arthur Vance's multi-million-dollar estate. He believed this afternoon would mark the moment he officially stepped into absolute wealth and control. Before Mr. Harrison began, Julian leaned over to me and slid a document across the table. His voice was a gentle, practiced whisper designed to sound caring. "Eleanor, honey, go ahead and sign this first. It's just a standard marital spousal waiver. It streamlines the transfer into our joint master trust, so you don't have to worry about the administrative burden." He handed me a pen, his eyes searching mine with intense pressure. I looked at the paper, then at him. I signed it. A slow, triumphant smirk spread across Julian's face. He snatched the document back, handed it to his attorney, and leaned back in his leather chair with his hands folded behind his head. He thought he had just outsmarted me. He believed he had successfully maneuvered me into signing away my primary claim to Dad's primary trust fund. Julian cleared his throat, looking directly at Mr. Harrison. "All right, let's wrap this up. Everything Eleanor's father built flows directly into our shared entity now. We're ready for the disbursement." He looked at me with an arrogant glance, practically congratulating himself on a job well done. Mr. Harrison carefully adjusted his glasses, completely unbothered by Julian's posturing. "Not so fast, Mr. Vance," the old attorney said softly. He reached down into his worn leather briefcase, bypassing the standard probate folders on the desk, and pulled out a thick, heavy yellow envelope. It was locked with a dark red wax seal. Across the front, written in my father's precise, unmistakable handwriting, were the words, "Open only if her husband claims everything." The temperature in the room instantly dropped. Julian's smirk flickered, then vanished. Mr. Harrison broke the red wax seal with a deliberate, crisp snap that echoed through the silent conference room. He unfolded the parchment inside, adjusted his reading glasses, and began to read aloud in a steady, measured voice. "I, Arthur Vance, being of sound mind, constructed this final directive. Throughout my life, I have observed the character of my daughter's husband, Julian. I have watched his relentless efforts to commandeer her autonomy and absorb her assets. Should Julian present a signed spousal waiver attempting to consolidate and seize my primary estate fund for himself, this second instrument immediately voids the primary trust structure." Julian's posture went rigid. "What is this nonsense?" "That's not legal," he snapped, his voice tight. "It is entirely legal, Mr. Vance," Mr. Harrison replied calmly, without breaking eye contact with the page. He continued reading. "The primary entity Julian has just claimed consists solely of my commercial liabilities, distressed real estate debt, and unresolved toxic environmental holdings accrued during early acquisitions. By signing the claim papers to take full ownership of my primary entity, Julian has legally assumed full personal indemnity for these debts." Julian's face drained of all color. His attorney scrambled through his briefcase, frantically grabbing the papers Julian had just signed, scanning the fine print with widening eyes. "Furthermore," Mr. Harrison read on, "the actual liquid assets, liquid equity, and debt-free properties amounting to $28 million were placed into an irrevocable blind trust 3 months ago. This trust is held under an independent corporate trustee, accessible exclusively by my daughter, Eleanor, completely shielded from marital assets or joint claims." "Stop. Don't read the rest. Stop reading," Julian shouted, slamming his palms onto the mahogany table as he pushed himself out of his chair. He lunged forward, grabbing the edge of the conference table, his knuckles white, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The polished financial advisor was gone. In his place stood a man realizing he had just maneuvered himself into financial ruin. He turned to his own lawyer, shaking. "Tell me this isn't binding. Tell me he can't do this." His attorney slowly looked up from the documents, his expression grim. "Julian, you signed the transfer papers without reading the secondary liability clause. You just legally adopted $34 million in commercial debt." The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by Julian's harsh, shallow breathing. His corporate lawyer slowly closed his leather folder, took off his reading glasses, and leaned toward Julian. "We need to leave. Now," the lawyer muttered, his voice barely audible. "You signed a binding indemnity clause. I cannot fight this, Julian. You need to prepare for a settlement immediately." Julian looked at his attorney as if he had been struck, then turned his gaze toward me. The arrogant, untouchable financial advisor was completely gone. In his place was a terrified man watching his carefully constructed life crumble around him. I didn't say a word. I simply picked up my handbag, adjusted my coat, and stood up from the conference table. "Eleanor, wait," Julian pleaded, his voice cracking as he reached out a trembling hand. "Please, honey, talk to me. We can fix this. I was just trying to protect our future, our joint security. You know I love you. We can handle this together." I looked at him, really looked at him for the first time in years. The charismatic smile, the polished confidence, the subtle manipulations, it had all been a facade. "My father protected my future, Julian," I said softly, my voice steady and free of anger. "You just revealed yours." I walked out of the mahogany-paneled office and down the quiet marble hallway, the sound of my heels echoing off the walls. Outside, the bright afternoon light hit my face, and for the first time in weeks, I could breathe. That same evening, while Julian was frantically calling every legal contact he knew, my father's estate team was already securing the deeds and accounts under my new independent trust. The locks on my father's properties remained safe, untouched by Julian's hands. 3 days later, while Julian was hiding out in his office dodging calls from lenders and debt collectors, a process server walked into his firm and handed him a thick, white envelope. It wasn't an estate document. It was a formal petition for divorce, backed by 3 years of meticulous forensic audit trails prepared by my father's legal team, detailing every cent Julian had ever attempted to divert from our marriage. 6 months later, the dust finally settled. The court proceedings were swift and unequivocal. Armed with my father's bulletproof estate architecture and forensic accounting, the judge dismissed every single one of Julian's counterclaims. Forced to absorb $34 million in commercial liabilities tied to the primary entity he had greedily claimed, Julian was forced to file for personal bankruptcy. The news spilled into the financial sector, destroying his professional credibility as an advisor. No firm would touch him, and his client roster evaporated overnight. Even his enabling family, who had spent years treating me like an outsider while eagerly awaiting their share of my father's wealth, completely abandoned him once they realized there was no money coming. They turned on each other in a frantic search for scapegoats, exposing the shallow nature of their loyalty. Meanwhile, I took full control of my father's $28 million estate. Guided by Mr. Harrison, I used a significant portion of the liquid assets to establish the Arthur Vance Foundation, a trust dedicated to providing housing security and financial literacy education for young women and single mothers. I stayed in my teaching position, continuing to share my love of history with my students, but now with a profound personal understanding of how power, hubris, and patience play out in the real world. I sold our joint house, bought a sunlit brownstone overlooking the park, and surrounded myself with quiet, honest things. I learned that true security doesn't come from grasping for control or orchestrating elaborate deceptions. It comes from standing firmly in the truth and surrounding yourself with people who value your character over your assets. Sometimes, late in the evening, I sit on my balcony with a cup of tea, listening to the city hum below. I think about my dad, his quiet wisdom, his sharp perception, and the ultimate protection he crafted for me. Julian thought he was walking away with everything, but in the end, he got exactly what he deserved. And I got something far more valuable than millions of dollars. I got my life back, completely free.